Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
This is Bloomberg Businessweek. Insight from the reporters and editors who bring you America's most trusted business magazine, plus global business, finance, and tech news. The Bloomberg Businessweek podcast with Massar and Tim Stenovec from Bloomberg Radio.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Bloomberg Businessweek Weekend Podcast. Fed Chair Jay Powell dominates our first hour thanks to an exclusive conversation with Carlyle's David Rubenstein this past week, and also because of another Bloomberg Businessweek exclusive and cover story with Republican presidential candidate Donald Trump, who was asked about keeping Chair Powell should Trump find himself back in the White House. All of that to come in just a moment.
We also leaned on one individual to tie up the Bloomberg world of markets, business, and yes, lots of politics. Stefan Seelig, former Undersecretary of Commerce for International Trade at the U.S. Department of Commerce during the Obama administration, stopped by to help us make sense of it all.
He did indeed. All of that to come. We begin with former President Donald Trump. It was 1 week ago that an assassination attempt was made on his life. This past week, the former president announced J.D. Vance as his vice president and running mate and officially became the Republican Party's candidate for president, all happening at the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee.
There is no victory in winning for half of America. So tonight, with faith and devotion, I proudly accept your nomination for President of the United States.
Donald Trump is also the cover story for the August issue of Bloomberg Businessweek, just out on newsstands, online, and on the Bloomberg. Businessweek editor Brad Stone, alongside Bloomberg White House correspondents Nancy Cook, Joshua Green, and Mario Parker, sat down with the former president at Mar-a-Lago for an exclusive interview to learn more about the policies that may come should he be elected to a second term. Everything from taxes to tariffs, Fed Chair Jay Powell, Taiwan, and more.
Here's Brad Stone, editor of Bloomberg Businessweek, on how the interview with Donald Trump all came together.
You know, earlier this year, we knew that we would be covering a momentous campaign. Business Week, obviously, it's our lane is business and the global economy, and so we reached out to both campaigns and we told each candidate that we asked for an interview focusing on business and the economy, and the Trump campaign responded first, and they were willing to do it. We went down to Mar-a-Lago on June 25th. I went with our White House colleagues, Mario Parker, Josh Green, Nancy Cook. We visited Mar-a-Lago late in the morning on a Tuesday. It's off season, so it's very quiet there in Palm Beach and at Mar-a-Lago. What can I say? It was, it's a little bit what you imagine, a little bit of that, that Trump-style luxury that one might be familiar with from his buildings and the former casinos. Lots of monuments to Trump in the clubhouse where we were, like birthday gifts, balloon towers in the bathrooms, like lots of Trump-focused mementos. And then the candidate himself came in and as I wrote, was personable, tries to be charming. I mean, it's interesting because you put him in front of a camera or a crowd and, he's not the biggest fan of the media, but he was, he wanted to do this. I think the cover of a magazine and the cover of Business Week means something to him. And he wanted, to get his message across.
What's interesting, too, Brad, I think about the interview and Trump's policies taking even greater urgency or becoming even more important to know in detail if you consider the events of the last couple of weeks. I'm thinking about President Biden's debate performance, not so great, as we know, the assassination attempt over the weekend and subsequent supercharged momentum that has come to the Trump campaign as a result. We really want to understand these policies and some of the kind of cues he has given maybe over the last couple of months. You guys wanted to dig deeper.
Yeah, I mean, there are two things. One is it's a pretty vague set of policy proposals. I mean, he talks about higher tariffs, lower taxes, stopping immigration at the border, but at the same time, he's targeting inflation. So, one, I think because these are vague, broad brushstrokes, it has allowed proxies to come in with things like Project 2025 or this independent white paper that suggested he could curtail the independence of the Federal Reserve. And there's been some confusion there. And in our interview, he kind of tried to walk that back and disavow some of these other projects. The other thing is that there are some contradictions in his plan. I mean, if you're attacking inflation, then increasing tariffs or shrinking the labor pool through harsher restrictions on immigration is not conventionally the way to do it. And so, we talked to a lot of independent economists in the story that point that out. As for pushing and pressing Trump on that, it was interesting. He kept bringing up William McKinley, the 25th president, a fellow Ohioan, I might add, who's probably most known for he was assassinated early in his second term. But he thinks that people are discounting the wisdom of tariffs, that you could drive not just revenue but tougher negotiations with your partners, and in a sense that he thinks it will all pencil out in the end, even though the campaign does not really talk about how they would account for the increase of the deficit that would come from things like permanently reducing the corporate tax rate.
Brad, everything ties back to economics and business, no question, and even foreign policy. And I'm curious about what you learned about his views regarding Taiwan, what he said about Ukraine, and sort of what surprised you about those.
Well, I mean, his riff on Taiwan was shocking in the moment and shocking as I reflect on it. I mean, he basically said that Taiwan is a U.S. ally. He said that Taiwan has stolen our chip business, that they should be paying us for protection, that it's thousands of miles away and very close to China, and he called it the apple of Xi's eye. So probably unsettling for Taiwan partisans. As it relates to Ukraine, things like Iran and Israel, I mean, he spins, a scenario where he doesn't think that the conflicts that are happening now would be occurring if he were still president. And of course, you can argue with that, but he traces it back to Iran and some of the sanctions there that were then lifted, in the nuclear agreement. And he just believes that America's enemies have been empowered after he left office.
I am curious, as you guys were talking to Donald Trump, Brad, at any point did you get a feeling he didn't want to go to certain areas, or was he pretty much an open book when it comes to maybe his policies, his economic policies during his second term?
Yeah, I don't recall any topic being off limits. I would say that there were certain areas where we pressed, the economic impact of tariffs, who he would bring into his administration, where, I think we probably ended up hitting the limit of his current thinking. At the time, he hadn't picked a vice presidential candidate. Obviously, we pressed him on that. He wasn't willing to go there yet. Now, of course, we know it's J.D. Vance. But, I mean, look, this was supposed to be a 45-minute interview, and Jason Miller, the campaign chair, tried to end it a couple of times, and President Trump kept talking to us. So there was a lot on his mind and nothing that was really off limits.
One thing I am curious, I feel like Donald Trump is somebody that, we've seen a lot in the media. You think about The Apprentice. I think about when he used to go on David Letterman and he was fixing the ice skating rink here in New York City. Like, there's just kind of a bigger than life kind of individual, larger than life individual. What was he like face to face? And we've seen him in sometimes debate or other, he's very combative. He's very, talking to a crowd. What was he like face to face?
Yeah, as I said before, I mean, I think you get a different Trump in a crowd or in front of a camera, and in the smaller setting, he's a little bit more solicitous. And it really struck me that he's quite absorbed with who likes him and who doesn't, and who's on his team and who isn't. So as an example, Carol, I showed him a copy of last month's Bloomberg Businessweek with Bernard Arnault on the cover. Well done. And he sat with it for a little bit. And this was before the interview, and then during the interview, maybe like 15 minutes in, he kind of stopped and said, by the way, your previous cover candidate, I'm friends with him. I'm curious if he said he was friends with me. So he wanted to know whether one of the wealthiest people in the world, Mr. Arnault, was a Trump supporter. Essentially, that's how I interpreted it. And we published a transcript, and you can see the whole conversation. But I think that was what surprised me. That he's quite interested in who's his supporter and who is.
And Brad, you were in Paris for that interview with Bernard Arnault. So remind everyone, did he say anything about the former president?
Did not come up.
Okay.
I did not have the foresight. Okay. But you know, when Trump was president, Arnault did open a factory. I think it was in Texas, and appeared with President Trump.
Hey, to that end, I'm wondering about how the thinking around this piece changed over the last few weeks, and really over the last few days as it was going to print. Because you mentioned you did this in late June. That was before the disastrous debate for President Biden. It was also before he had picked a running mate. And it was also, of course, before what happened on Saturday with the assassination attempt. So talk a little bit about how your thinking around the piece changed before publication and since you did the interview.
Yeah, Tim, not much changed. This was a cover story about the candidate and his plan for the economy and for American business. That didn't change. What we did have to reconsider was the timing, just because, this is a little bit right off the current events of last weekend, and we didn't want it to get lost in the well-deserved attention that was coming to the incident in Pennsylvania. I mean, yeah, obviously it could have affected it a whole lot more, and thank heavens it didn't. But if anything, I think maybe the importance of the story went up. It's just because, Trump was already, to my mind, feeling a lot of momentum on June 25th. It seemed to me that he had a bounce in his step. And as Carol, as you said, recent events over the past few weeks have transpired to at least make it appear that he has the momentum right now coming into the GOP convention. As I say in the editor's note, a lot can change. It's July, but this is why we think that the time is right for more attention on his economic agenda.
Hey, you talk about momentum behind Trump, a lot of attention. He is getting momentum around from folks in Silicon Valley. You understand the tech community so well, having spent so many years covering it and writing about it. Having said that, whether it's Elon Musk and some other entrepreneurs out of Silicon Valley, seems like he's getting a fair amount of love, but not from corporate America. And that is something we've been talking about, certainly among the publicly held companies. You guys talked a little bit about that?
Yeah, and let me say two things. One, I do think we're hearing some loud voices from Silicon Valley that are in Trump's camp, but there's no real telling whether that's a minority or a majority. I think that there's a risk calculation that investors and entrepreneurs engage in tech, and the risk calculation here is if you support Trump and he wins, you're on the right side of a president who remembers his friends and enemies, and if Biden wins, that support doesn't necessarily make a difference. And so I think that what you're seeing in the business community now is, and I quote some folks saying this, is there's a lot of fear. You might not think that Donald Trump deserves a second term, but being overt about it and getting on his enemies list, might end up hurting you. So if you're a big public CEO, you might have a fiduciary duty to your shareholders to kind of keep your nose down right now. And I think that's a little bit of what we're seeing in the business community.
Interesting. Hey, Brad, one thing that we've been talking a lot about, and it's also getting a lot of attention outside the newsroom, is the transcript of the interview with the former president and the Republican nominee. Because you and the team over at Bloomberg Businessweek fact-checked the transcript, and I encourage everybody to check it out online because it has sort of hyperlinks to footnotes that include context and information and a lot of numbers based on what the former president said. Talk a little bit about that process, because that's not something that we see with every interview.
No, it's not. And by the way, I think we would do that for other interviews with other presidential candidates too. So it's not anything special or unique for Donald Trump. But look, I mean, this was a 90-minute conversation. There were parts of his answers and also, frankly, parts of our questions that we thought deserved either more context or correcting the public record. This is also something that we've seen other news organizations do. I think it's a great way to add just extra context for our readers. But along the way, offering the candidates' remarks in a totally transparent form. So in my mind, it was sort of the best of both worlds. It was not an easy task. It's a 90-minute conversation that covered a lot of ground. And so kudos to my colleagues in the Washington D.C. bureau who did the hard work.
I just want to confirm, you did not go home with a MAGA hat, right?
So at the end of the he had his aide Stephen Miller go out of the room during the interview to come back with the hat that said Trump was right about everything, and he was crowing about the hat, and as I said, he was bragging about a bunch of things, and he tried to give it to us at the end, and we politely declined.
And Coke or Diet Coke?
Coke.
Yeah, he did go on his riff about thin people not drinking Diet Coke.
Okay.
All right, Brad Stone, incredible. Your second monthly issue and an incredible cover story. That is, of course, the editor of Bloomberg Businessweek, Brad Stone. Check out the new issue of Bloomberg Businessweek on newsstands. Catch it online and on the Bloomberg. So appreciate it. So many different aspects. Our team has been all over the different pieces of it.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Business Week podcast. Catch us live weekday afternoons from 2 to 5 p.m. Eastern. Listen on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business App. Or watch us live on YouTube.
We have leaned on our next guest many times throughout the global pandemic, in the days following the murder of George Floyd, throughout the twists and turns of the 2020 presidential race, and so much more. He is someone who's worked in leadership roles in both the private and public sectors, including a nearly 30-year career on Wall Street, which is why we love talking about him, about so much of what is the Bloomberg world. He is former Undersecretary of Commerce for International Trade at the U.S. Department of Commerce. That was during the Obama administration. Headed up the International Trade Administration. I could go on, but then we'd be done. Let's get to it. Stefan Seelig is back with us, managing partner and founder of Bridge Park Advisors, the financing advisory firm, here in our Bloomberg studio. This environment, I'm not quite sure where to start, but it does feel like politics is the right place to start in terms of what might happen in November. Does it matter who ultimately is in the White House come November?
Look, I think it depends on what the issue is, right? And so some of the things we've talked about in the past, like China, this is one topic, or maybe the only topic, where Democrats and Republicans seem, quite aligned, which is getting tougher on China. I'm not sure policies will be radically different between a Trump and potentially a Biden administration. I think the deficit ain't going down with either president. I think defense spending is going up with either president. I think as a result of that, from an economic perspective, I'm not sure there's going to be a ton of difference. I think from a political perspective, clearly, President Trump is going to be much more isolationist. He is going to have much stricter immigration policies, and he is going to spend a lot of money. And so I think what all that does, which is why you're seeing the steepening of the yield curve, the so-called Trump trade that you've talked about, and the strengthening of the dollar, is, those are all going to be quite inflationary, especially if he adopts some of these more aggressive tariff proposals that he's talked about, both with China and in imports, which could be Trumpian hyperbole.
Right.
But if it does happen, inflation is going to go up dramatically. And
can you play that out for us? Because I think there's times in terms of, I think of voters who are just trying to pay their bills at this point. But how would that potentially play out and impact the U.S. economy and U.S. citizens?
Well, tariffs are nothing else other than, taxes, right? They're taxes on goods, and unfortunately they're quite regressive, because the people that are impacted most are, the folks that are paying their bills every month in groceries and car payments and everything else. And so prices will go up. There was not a very significant impact in the Trump original set of tariffs, because they were not that significant. And President Biden obviously kept them largely in place. So the real question is he going to be much more aggressive in the next term? And if that is going to happen, some economists are talking about 100 basis point, 200 basis point increases in inflation, let alone about the impact and the slowing of the economy overall.
You talk to CEOs all the time in your position at Bridge Park Advisors. What are they telling you?
Well, look, before we talk about the CEO perspective in a moment, I almost have a counterintuitive point of view, which is the strengthening of Trump from this horrific assassination attempt could in fact have an opposite of the Trump trade, which is this could be maybe an accelerant to having a changed Democratic ticket.
Really?
And if that were to be the case, just based on the poll numbers, you'd actually argue for taking the opposite side of that trade, because now Biden looks so much weaker than even he did after the debate that may force Democratic leadership and the president himself to really reevaluate whether or not he wants to stay in. And I have no perspective on whether that is going to be the case or not, but it is interesting that the strengthening of Trump could have that potential outcome.
Do you realistically see a scenario in the next few weeks where there is a change at the top of the ticket? I mean, the president did reiterate he's in it to win it.
Yeah, we've all heard the same thing on the one hand. On the other hand, despite what you may think about the president and some of his policies, I believe he is a true patriot and he wants to do the right thing for the country. And if he becomes convinced that he is not going to be able to beat Donald Trump, he may change his mind. Because at the end of the day, this is not just a narcissistic decision. It is a decision that many people believe is going to fundamentally affect, and I'm sure he does, the direction of this country. Going back to your question about CEOs, what I would say is, first of all, most Fortune 500 CEOs are Republicans. So, I don't know, polls have been taking 75% are Republicans. So you're starting with a base that most CEOs of big companies would vote for Trump kind of along party lines on the one hand. On the other hand, for this particular candidate, in the conversations I've had, I don't see much enthusiasm. For one, I don't think they appreciate his style. Two is some of these policies, CEOs are not isolationist. They are not xenophobic. They are not protectionist. They don't like tariffs. And so they don't like all of the social policies that are being talked about, for example, LGBTQ rights. And so while I think on the one hand, many of them are seeing the writing on the wall and as a result not standing up and lining behind President Biden. On the other hand, I don't think there's a lot of enthusiasm for this particular president as much as there is enthusiasm for traditionally centrist Republican policies as a way to drive corporate profits and corporate prosperity.
One of the things that we've been talking a lot about is kind of the establishment folks in Silicon Valley, or really in kind of the venture startup world, and their backing of Donald Trump and J.D. Vance, it seems like at this point. Why do you think that they appeal to them? Is it tax? What is it?
Well, part of it is J.D. Vance, had a job in Silicon Valley for a while. And so I think there is a little bit of a connection that he has personally with some of those folks.
But Peter Thiel and Elon were backing Trump for a long time.
Yeah, and I would say, frankly, Carol, those are not really representative of the Fortune 500 establishment traditionally. Now, it may be the new world order, but it certainly wasn't the world order of the last generation. Well,
is it important to make that distinction? Because it's interesting; they're in the headlines a lot.
Sure, but they're in the headlines a lot because of the huge wealth and success of Elon Musk and a number of other folks that like to comment on this. But traditionally, corporate CEOs are going to be much more reticent for making public political statements, right, because it's kind of not their lane and not their job. So as a result of that, you kind of have the squeaky wheel sort of phenomenon where you have folks like Bill Ackman that like to comment on these things, and Elon Musk, because of X and other things, that likes to comment on these things, where traditional corporate executives, I think, because their customers and their clients are both Republicans and Democrats, are quite chary about being as vocal.
Hey, well, speaking of that, we did just speak to Kara Murphy over at Kestra Investment Management, and she encouraged our listeners and our viewers to look beyond the election and argued that who's in the White House really doesn't matter when it comes to financial markets. That said, we spoke to Reid Hoffman, the LinkedIn founder and billionaire, about 6 weeks ago over at our San Francisco conference, and he said it absolutely does matter because he's concerned about a lack of stability as a result of a Trump presidency. What side are you on? Does it matter who's in the White House?
I think of course it matters, but you also have to ask that question in conjunction with what happens to the Congress. And is it going to be a divided government or not a divided government? Because that is a natural check and balance that I think will cause some of the more extreme outcomes from taking place. What I would say is, the United States' position in the world will clearly be different between these two governments. And, former President Trump and President Biden have a different worldview in terms of cooperation, internationalism versus isolationism. And that is going to impact not only the citizenry, but impact businesses in many respects. And so I don't think it can be ignored. I am not quite as alarmist as some folks in terms of the end of democracy and civil war and some of the other things that some people are talking about. On the one hand, I do think this is an important election, and we need to be rightly talking about the issues.
Stefan, do you feel like you worked within the government, the Obama administration? Do we still have checks and balances?
Obviously, our system hasn't changed. What has changed, Carol, is we used to govern from the middle, and now we're governing from the extremes in both parties. And that is what creates a lot of, I think, these tensions and a lot of our ineffectiveness in terms of our ability to implement any policies. And I think, frankly, and this is my personal point of view, until we get back to the middle, we're going to have some real issues, because that's what creates the animosity and the ability to collaborate. And when President Biden was in the Senate, he was notoriously well known, and rightly so, for actually being able to collaborate across the aisle. And you don't see that from either party at the moment, and I don't see that changing with this election in either direction.
You did say until we get back to the middle, which strikes me as really optimistic. Do you see within, it's not I
think he said he was an optimist.
Within our lifetimes, we get back to the middle?
I don't know, Tim. You may as well be hopeful, because it's better than the other choice.
Yeah.
That's fair. Your clients, what do they ask you most about?
Well, I think at the moment, as you rightly said, there was a whole conversation around what was going to happen on the top of the Democratic ticket, then the implications of the assassination attempt, clearly. But I think there's still a lot of uncertainty in the economy. And you guys spent a lot of time, understandably, talking about the markets, but the markets and the real economy are divergent. And the fact is that despite being at all-time highs in the equity markets, consumer sentiment is not high. Savings are being depleted. Inflation is going up. Costs to consumers are going up. Car payments, mortgage payments are higher because of interest rates, and that's creating a real sense of a lack of prosperity with most American households. And households, Carol, you know this, households don't own a lot of stock.
Right.
So all of that good stuff that we talk about in the equity markets really doesn't impact households traditionally. And even that high equity market, and you guys talk about this all the time, it's really technology. Right. And it's not just technology, it's a handful of companies in the technology sector.
Why do you think that so much of America is struggling at a time when the economy is so good for so many people?
Well, I don't know, Tim. Is it so good for so many people? There's a real wealth gap, and it's good for a lot of, I think, your listeners who occupy a certain economic position in this country, and I'm not so sure it's so good for so many people. A lot of people are struggling, and that is why this populism that President Trump and J.D. Vance espouse has become so popular. And I think, we can't ignore that. And, we can all have stylistic concerns and concerns about some of their policies, but the people, the Americans that they are talking to, really feel what they are trying to address.
Yeah, I think it explains very much the political environment that we are, not just in the United States, but really globally, right, in terms of people not feeling that they're doing better.
For sure. And, Brexit, the elections in France, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, this is a global phenomenon.
Thank you. As always, Stefan Seelig, he's managing partner at Bridge Park Advisors.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Business Week podcast. Listen live each weekday starting at 2 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business App. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
On inflation, in the first quarter, we didn't make any more progress. The second quarter, actually, we did make some more progress. We've had now 3 better readings. And if you average them, that's a pretty good pace.
That's Federal Reserve Chair Jay Powell talking with David Rubenstein this past Monday at an Economic Club of Washington luncheon event. It was just about a week and a half ago that Chair Powell was up on Capitol Hill for 2 days of congressional testimony that was followed by cooling inflation data. It all comes ahead of another FOMC meeting at the end of this month.
In David's conversation, Fed Chair Powell declined to give any guidance on the timing of interest rate moves. That kind of makes sense, right, Carol? That's not surprising.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
He did, though, say that the most recent CPI data, quote, do add somewhat, end quote, to confidence that inflation is heading down to the central bank's 2% goal and that labor markets are now in a, quote, better place.
Right. We got another kind of confirmation of that as jobless claims were ticking up. So again, some softening in the labor market. Not coming undone, but nonetheless some softening. Well, the conversation, though, on Monday also touched on the assassination attempt on Donald Trump and whether Jay Powell would serve another term as Federal Reserve Chairman if Donald Trump is back in the White House. All of this, we do want to point out, happening before the Bloomberg headlines and Bloomberg Businessweek cover story on Donald Trump saying he wouldn't seek to remove Powell before his term ends in 2026.
Now let's get to our conversation with David Rubenstein, who is a co-founder of the private equity firm Carlyle, also a Bloomberg host, for more on his talk with Fed Chair Jay Powell.
Well, I am the chairman of the Economic Club of Washington, and in that capacity, I often interview government leaders and business leaders, and Jay Powell had been somebody I'd interviewed before. He had worked at my firm a number of years ago, well before he was at the Fed, and so we worked out a date that I would do this interview today, and we had about 700 people there, and obviously a live TV audience.
David, we were chuckling the whole time. I mean, this was like a Powell that you don't see at press conferences, a Powell that you don't see every day. It's clear that you two are familiar with one another. What did you want to get out of the interview? Because we know that he's not going to give us any indication about a rate path. He established that at the top of the interview. What did you want to get out of it?
Well, I think it's always good to humanize well-known people, and people can understand them better and the way they make decisions and the way they kind of handle their job. And I thought humanizing him would be always good. Clearly, when you're chairman of the Fed, you talk in what I've often called Fed speak, which is to say it's very difficult for the average person to understand it. But Jay does a better job than some of his predecessors in speaking in common English because he's not a trained economist. And I just thought giving people an update on his perspectives on the economy would be a good thing. I mean, obviously, as you point out, he's not going to announce at an interview with me that he's lowering interest rates. You can't expect that. But I think he gave a pretty good description of how they decide to lower interest rates or increase interest rates. And I thought it was informative. And therefore, I thought, he accomplished his goal, which is to kind of, show people how he makes decisions. And I accomplished my goal, which is to kind of humanize the chairman of the Fed a little bit more than maybe he otherwise would be.
Well, David, help us understand your relationship. You mentioned that you guys do go back years, of course. He was a partner at the Carlyle Group before he went into public service. I'm wondering if you're in touch with him regularly now, if you consider him a friend. Just give us an idea of your relationship with him.
I wouldn't say I'm in touch with him regularly. When you're chairman of the Fed, I think it's somebody like me doesn't want to be calling him up all the time. And, I don't want to look like I'm trying to get information from him. And he worked at Carlyle for years, but I wouldn't say I was his closest friend or vice versa. So I know him reasonably well. I've interviewed him, I think, 3 times or 4 times at the Economic Club of Washington, and I have a good relationship with him, but I wouldn't say we're close as friends, but I certainly like him and admire what he's done for the country and the job that he's had.
What's interesting, too, and something we've talked a lot about, David, is, the neutral rate and what he thinks about that 2% goal that the Federal Reserve has. Right. He said the neutral rate is probably higher today. Monetary policy is restrictive, but not severely restrictive. I am curious how you see things. Do you think the neutral rate doesn't make sense anymore, that it does need to be higher? And what is your expectation or what you think the Fed should be doing when it comes to interest rates right now?
Well, I think the country will do much better off listening to Jay Powell's views on where the interest rates should go than probably my views on interest rates. But I think it's a general sense that the market is believing that there will be a cut. And I think Jay made it clear that he doesn't listen to the political situation. So I have said in speeches that I thought it would be unlikely that the Fed would want to cut during a presidential election period of time. But I think he's made it clear that that's not his view or the view of the FOMC, that if they think the data warrants a cut, they will have a cut. and therefore the Fed could do something at the end of July when they meet, or they could do something again when they meet in September. And my guess is that sometime before the Fed meets after the election, they will do something. That'd be my current thinking. The economy could change, and obviously data is everything. But right now, the markets are anticipating, and I think the Fed is not shutting down the idea that something could happen before the election.
Before the election, okay. Do you think that the election in any way sways? I mean, we're all human, right? And we can say we're very objective, but we're human and impacted by lots of things that are going on in this world. Do you think that Jay Powell and policymakers at the Fed might be swayed a little bit, a small influence when it comes to the November election, presidential election?
I think the Fed, everything Jay says is that they don't really pay attention to the election dates. And I think right now, since so many people pay attention to the markets and the interest rates where they are, that I think that the Fed will do what the data suggests is appropriate. And when the data gets to the point where they see inflation more or less getting to 2% and the economy softening a bit, I suspect they will not wait until after the election because they don't want to be seen as political. And therefore, while they might be criticized by some for lowering interest rates before the end of before the election's over, I just think the Fed has given enough signals, including today, that they're not going to worry about the election. They'll do what the data suggests is appropriate.
I do wonder, David, as you said, you've talked with Jay Powell several times, certainly in this format. So, monetary policy, obviously, and the economy first and foremost. And there are certain things that Jay Powell will go. You guys laugh about some of the things he will obviously not reveal. But having said that, at the end of the conversation, when it comes to the things the Bloomberg audience cares so much about in terms of monetary policy and the economy, what was your key takeaway from Jay Powell?
My key takeaway from the interview and with my discussion with him is that he's a man who's very much on top of the data. He enjoys the job, not worn out by it. Doesn't say, woe is to me, I have got all this pressure on my shoulder. I think he can deal with it quite well. He's used to it. He's been in the chair for quite some time. I think he's reasonably happy now with where the economy is. Remember, we didn't go into the hard landing that everybody was predicting. Yeah. People thought there would be a recession last year or this year. That didn't happen. So whoever gets credit for it, the Fed deserves some share of that credit because they managed the economy into a really nice soft landing, so-called. And so right now, while unemployment is going up, I don't think it's going up by such a level that's scaring people. And I think the markets are in pretty good shape and the economy is in pretty good shape.
He didn't want to comment on the market, the idea of the so-called Trump trade returning after this horrific event. He was clear about that up on top, but I'm at the top of the interview. But I'm curious about your view and what you think is being priced into markets right now. David, the Fed chair not weighing in, but politically, what is being priced in right now?
Well, clearly, the events no doubt scared a lot of people about the violence that is still prevalent in this country in many areas, unfortunately. And so, fortunately, we did not have an assassination, though one person did die, tragically, and another person is still in the hospital for the wounds that person suffered as well. Sad situation. Obviously, the investigations will figure out what the Secret Service could have done differently or better. I'm not an expert in that area, so I just can't say what they will find. But clearly, we haven't eliminated violence from our political situation, unfortunately.
David, you've served in the federal government. You were chief counsel to the U.S. Senate Judiciary's Committee Subcommittee back in the 70s, deputy assistant to the president for domestic policy during the Carter administration. The democracy has faced other heavy periods before. It feels rather heavy today. Is there something different this time around? You are, I feel like it's safe to say, a student of history. You respect past leaders and what they've done. How do you make sense of this particular political and historical period?
Well, it's difficult to really put it in context right now because you can't really tell what the historical impact of it is until many years afterwards. But right now, the country seems to be fairly bitterly divided between the Democrats and Republicans. And it wasn't the case 50 years ago or so when John Kennedy ran for president against Richard Nixon in 1960. They campaigned in most of the states because they didn't know how the states would go. Now the country's fairly divided, so we know how almost all the states are going to go. There are only 5 or 6, maybe 7 states where it's a kind of a swing state. So it's much different than it used to be. The tensions between both sides seem to be much greater than they used to be. Bipartisanship is something that is not as common as it used to be in Washington, D.C. So I don't know whether the events of this weekend will scare people into saying we should try to be less I'd say, violent in our rhetoric and less condemning of other sides. But clearly, President Trump has suggested that he would make a more unifying speech than he otherwise was going to make. And I think President Biden's speech last night was designed to also have a unifying impact. Whether we can unify our country in a way like this, that way I think we should, I don't know, but it will probably have some beneficial impact, though obviously the events were tragic.
David, are you optimistic, given the heated political environment right now?
I'm optimistic that the country is in reasonable shape economically. Politically, we can do more than we have been doing to kind of bring the country together. And that part, the jury is still out. But I'm hopeful that while the events were tragic over the weekend, that they'll have some beneficial impact in getting both sides, Democrats and Republicans, to try to work together more cooperatively.
Jay Powell said to you, predictions are very difficult, especially about the future. When you think about the future for the United States, politically, economically, what's top of mind? And curious if you have any plans to maybe want to be at the Federal Reserve. You guys talked about if it's a good job.
Well, I think it's really hard to kind of say that all of a sudden we're going to eliminate all the schisms that we've had in the last couple of years. Clearly, there are a lot of tensions between the two political sides. Jay Powell has been appointed by a Republican president and reappointed by a Democratic president, and he's done a really good job of kind of walking a fine line of not trying to be seen as political or Democratic or Republican. I think he deserves a lot of credit for that. Well, I think he's done a good job. And remember, this is not a job that anybody really thinks is an easy job. Many people who have emerged from the job, are generally applauded after they've served, but when they're serving, very often they get criticized by both sides, and it's hard to be chairman of the Fed. And in fact, as one chairman of the Fed once said, William McChesney Martin, my job is to take away the punch bowl at the party, which is to say, take away all the fun that you would want to get. And so that's the job of the chairman of the Fed, is to take away the punch bowl, and people don't like that.
Absolutely. David Rubenstein, thank you so much. Busy day for you, and so appreciate checking in with you. Bloomberg host and Carlyle co-founder and co-chair, David Rubenstein. You can catch his show in conversation with Jay Powell, July 24th at 9 p.m. Wall Street time on Bloomberg TV. This is Bloomberg.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Business Week podcast. Catch us live weekday afternoons from 2 to 5 p.m. Eastern. Listen on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business App. Or watch us live on YouTube.
Plenty ahead in our second hour of the weekend edition of Bloomberg Business Week, including a retired NASA astronaut on sharing space and the privatization of space travel.
Plus, the Porsche's first 911 hybrid that comes with more power, speed, and a start button. And a $165,000 price tag.
And I got to tell you something. Hannah Elliott, who reviews cars for Our World, she loved it. Yeah. All right, first up this hour, the Great Space Race, which when it comes up, a lot of people probably think of the billionaires. You know, Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, Richard Branson. There's a different kind of space race, though, happening, and that is the race to fill low Earth orbit. We're talking about satellites.
Originally, launching satellites was the role of governments, but with the number of satellites orbiting the Earth, commercial or otherwise, expected to quadruple in the coming years, it's become an increasingly commercialized venture.
That is the focus of the new HBO documentary, Wild Wild Space. Take a listen.
You've heard about the billionaire space race. This isn't that movie. We're in the midst of a revolution in space. It's like the Wild West.
The era of governments controlling this stuff is over.
At Astra Space, I run a secret rocket company.
Chris is this living embodiment of Silicon Valley.
I'm a scientist and he is a capitalist.
We're trying to build NASA at 1/1,000,000th the budget. And people take it really seriously, right?
If you're declaring to the world that you have a product that works, it better bloody work. I started Rocket Lab in 2006.
You could not have a more unlikely background for starting a rocket company.
No university education, no aerospace background. Let's start a company.
Peter's rocket is a very high-performance machine, but it's expensive to build.
We often get accused of building Ferraris.
Or more like a Ford, a much more high-volume product. If Peter's not right, Peter loses. If I'm not right, I adapt. We hit something.
I'm not built to build.
I'm going to crucify him.
The fabric of our civilization runs on satellites.
There is a lot of money to be made up there.
Space is now open for business.
Nothing's riding on this, except things like our right to privacy.
There are commercial companies that have nothing to do with governments snapping pictures day after day.
And the power of the world falling into the wrong hands.
So now you have thousands of satellites which themselves are potentially weapons.
And whoever controls space may very well control the future of humanity.
That's the new HBO documentary, Wild Wild Space, which premiered last Wednesday on the streaming service Max. The documentary is inspired by Bloomberg Businessweek feature writer Ashley Vance's book, When the Heavens Went on Sale, The Misfits and Geniuses Racing to Put Space Within Reach. Ashley's also the author of the first Elon Musk biography ever written. It's called Elon Musk, Tesla, SpaceX, and the Quest for a Fantastic Future. He joined us alongside Oscar-winning director Ross Kaufman, who directed Wild Wild Space, among other films.
Well, I'd done the Elon Musk biography, which came out around 2015, and was not a space nerd going into that, but SpaceX was my favorite stuff to report on. And then right when I finished the book, pretty much because I think SpaceX had proven some things out and commercial space felt real, there were these rocket and satellite companies that suddenly were popping up, not just in the United States, but all over the world. And everyone thought, oh, I'm going to be the next Elon Musk and whatever. You know, people thought maybe you can actually make a go of this. And so I just kind of caught the bug, and I spent a couple years going literally all over the world trying to find the most interesting stories. And so, you know, a bunch of those went into the book, and then started filming a bit along the way, just because I had this access to these rooms. You don't usually get to have a camera, and we kind of caught the companies young enough where you were able to like be in the mission control and film these things that you never ever get to see when a rocket blows up. And
that's what I was amazed about. Yeah. I'm like, well, wait a minute, how the heck did they know? Like, I was like, was the footage with somebody else? But you were filming it all along.
Yeah, I mean, some of this, you know, I credit the companies for giving us this access and taking this risk. Astra Space is one of the main companies in the film. The CEO, Chris Kemp, we had this arrangement early on when it was really 5 people in a garage. He said, look, if you want to go on this journey, you can tell the truth, whatever happens, good or bad, and come with us all the way to orbit for the first time. And that ended up being this very winding road. And to Chris's credit, he did let me do what he said.
And you feel it. Ross, come on in. So how did you come into the picture? And when you also were able to finally like see some of the stuff that Ashley had, you know, filmed, were you like, oh my God, a gift?
Well, it was really, first of all, I got a call from HBO, and they said, hey, Ross, we have this documentary footage. It wasn't a documentary yet. They had this footage that this author from Bloomberg filmed, and it's kind of all over the place, to be honest with you. And they said, we'd love for you to come in, take a look at some of the footage, and then see if you feel like you can make a movie out of it in some way, shape, or form. And so I went in, and I didn't realize, no one had told me there was about 300 hours of footage. So I was like, okay, well, this is a bit more of a job than I thought. And so, but I screened the footage with my editor, and some of the footage was incredible. Yeah. I mean, being in those rooms where rockets crash, and it was incredible. And then some of the footage was really not. It was funny. We really had to really gut through it all and try to figure out. What I love, and I said this before, is that when you first started shooting, Ashley, the footage is not very good because you didn't really know how to film the people. But as you progressed, as the years went by, the footage got better it mirrored how the companies functioned, right? And it really, like, stylistically, it was perfect. Yeah. But who could have ever thought that? Anyway, so that's kind of how I got involved.
At what point, Ross, did you sort of have the story come into place?
About 5 minutes before we finished editing.
Because it really is. Yeah. It's not a. You're not telling. You're sort of telling a story in real time. Yeah. I mean, you know, this stuff is. You can check the stock prices of some of these companies today. Still,
you might not want to.
Exactly, you might not want to for some of them.
Well, a couple.
But you follow the process from essentially from birth all the way to going public during this crazy run up during like with SPACs and COVID. Like when did you figure out the story?
Well, we were literally shooting until maybe a month before we finished editing.
Wow.
Yeah, things are happening, and that's the beauty of verite documentaries. You know, you're following things as they're progressing.
Right.
I mean, this kind of film kind of stops. It doesn't end. You know what I mean? I mean, the film itself ends, but the process is like, all right, we have to stop filming at some point, and this is the film. So that's kind of what I love about this kind of filmmaking, is fly on the wall filmmaking. You get in that edit room, and that's where you craft the story.
Well, Ashley is an incredible storyteller, and we've been very lucky to have him here at Bloomberg and be able to talk to him about all of his stories. on space and whatever you're working on. Having said that, how was it to see kind of the book come to life, and what was important to you in telling these stories?
It was really cool. As Ross was saying, I had never made a film before. I just had this idea. This would be a cool thing to try, to do a movie and a book at the same time. It turns out I bit off more than I could chew. And look, I mean, Ross has won an Academy Award. It was amazing to have him come on. And so, he came on with fresh eyes. I had spent years reporting on these subjects. You start to lose a little bit of perspective of what the wider world knows, what they don't know, what's going to appeal. And so Ross had gone through the book. He'd gone through the footage, and as you guys saw, a lot of this story is this group of friends who were at NASA Ames, which is the NASA Silicon Valley Center, in their 20s. They had this guy, Pete Worden, who was the head. He was this iconoclastic brigadier general who wanted...
Here's the dad and the grandfather and the uncle all rolled into one.
Is, right? And he brought in all these young kids and wanted them to do weird stuff in space, like go show that NASA can be better, was basically it. And so I think Ross, got into a lot of that part of the story, and that sort of ends up becoming the heart. And so, it was really gratifying to see it come out of the book and to see how another storyteller, what they were interested in and how they told it.
Well, Ashley's certainly a prominent part of the film, but it also focuses on three founders. We've mentioned some of them: Peter Beck of Rocket Lab, Chris Kemp of Astra, and Will Marshall of Planet Labs. Coming in it from a perspective of somebody outside of the industry as a filmmaker, I mean, are there three more perfect characters who you could put on the screen and follow? I mean, these guys are
so true.
Truly.
Well, it was
for
great.
Different reasons.
Absolutely. But there's this unifying principle that we kind of came up with at a certain point very early on. And everything kind of fell into place. The principle was, I love found families. In all my films, they end up being these crazy families and in this case, this Brigadier General, Pete Worden, brought in these young people, and they became this little found family. And I was like, that's kind of what I love. And there was love there. Their friendship, there's love, and that's kind of a big part of this film. And people just have a great time. This is a really funny film. It's a bit of a romp. So bringing these people together, figuring out the characters, because Ashley's book it's got more than 3 or 4 characters.
Right.
You have multiple characters and companies. So that was, just trying to figure out who do we follow? Well, that was the principle that we went with. And I think it worked.
Yeah, I do feel like the 3 main characters are kind of, Freudian id, ego, and superego. But we can talk about that in just a moment.
Definitely archetypes, yeah.
Did you guys agree, though, these were the 3 characters, these were the 3 companies you had to tell the story about?
I think there were a lot of discussions along the way, but we never had really, I don't ever remember any fights or disputes or anything.
Well, I'm just going to say very clearly, I had a couple of things going for me. 1, I knew nothing about space, and 2, Ashley's an incredible person to work with. And the book was amazing, so it was kind of seamless.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Business Week podcast. Listen live each weekday starting at 2 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business App. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
We're back talking with a couple of the folks behind Wild Wild Space. It's a new HBO documentary. As we mentioned, the film follows entrepreneurs of 3 companies. One of those is Astra Space. And here's the co-founder of Astra, Chris Kemp, counting down to a launch.
This is our last day in our launch window. We're going to get it this time. It's going to happen.
Yay. All right.
It's going to happen.
I think so too. Counting down.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, go.
Well, that one obviously.
I'm going to say for those listening on radio, the launch finally went off.
Yeah.
In case you were wondering.
That's from Wild Wild Space, the new documentary premiering at 9 p.m. tonight Wall Street Time on HBO.
All right, let's get back to Ashley Vance, features writer at Bloomberg Businessweek, author of the first Elon Musk biography, Elon Musk, Tesla, SpaceX, and the Quest for a Fantastic Future, and a producer of the film. And with us, Academy Award winner Ross Kaufman. He is the director of Wild Wild Space. An earlier film of his, Born into Brothels, won the Oscar for Best Documentary 2005, as well as the Emmy for Best Documentary 2005. And he's been taking pictures in the studio, and we're assuming they're going to be killer pictures. We all want copies of them. We're just going to put it out there.
Maybe get us an Academy Award.
That's a lot of pressure.
No pressure.
All right. So, Ashley, tell us, I keep saying the id, ego, and super ego. You do have three main characters and companies that are profiled. Tell us about them.
Yeah, well, Chris Kemp, who we got to see in the clip, I always thought of him as this archetype of Silicon Valley. Almost, he's this unbridled ambition, this person who'll stop at nothing to achieve his goals. He's, as we mentioned in the film, he's a capitalist and quite driven. We have this guy, Will Marshall, who is the founder and CEO of Planet Labs. I've known him forever. We describe him as a space hippie in the film. I think that's fair. He's always tried, he kind of came from this university background where he was trying to do good in space. They've created all these imaging satellites that track rainforests and the movement of refugees and things like that. And then we've got Peter Beck, who comes from New Zealand. It's probably one of the most incredible stories you'll ever hear. He has no college education. He's self-taught in aerospace, which does not happen. Just so people know.
Phenomenal.
You're supposed to have a PhD at the least to do this. And, these days Rocket Lab is really, after SpaceX, is really the most legit rocket company there is, and Peter is just that archetypal engineer. I mean, he is rockets call to him. He has to build things with his hands. This is what he was put on Earth to do, and he's possessed and all that. And then some of these characters, we see them, these things get challenged over time. Will Marshall starts as a space hippie, still is one, but Planet goes public during all this. It does a lot of deals with governments. Its satellites sit in this weird place between nonprofit and not spying, but kind of watching everything that happens for governments. And so, I think the film gets into some of that.
Yeah, talk a little bit about that tension, Ross, because that's something that is certainly notable, is this idea of optimism and opportunity among the characters, but at the same time, this idea of democratizing imaging of every single thing every single day on Earth is something that, if not used correctly and in the hands of somebody with ulterior motives, isn't necessarily a good thing.
Absolutely. It's like anything. Look at the internet, right? People went in with the best intentions, and it doesn't always work out. Individuals are flawed. It's gray area. These companies have to make money. It's a slippery slope, and we're kind of dependent on these individuals, hoping that they will do the right thing. But when it comes to the bottom line, even the best intentions can sometimes go awry. So I feel like this film also sheds light on a lot of the issues that we are not only facing, but we will face.
I got to tell you, one of the things that kind of blew my mind is just how crowded it's getting. I know Bloomberg has done some reporting on this, and you think about, all of these satellites that are, floating around, and I do wonder kind of how you are thinking about that, and do we need to be worried? Do we need to clean it up? It's something you guys bring up in the film.
I thought about it a lot. Part of the reason I went into this book and the film was, I'm a nerd, so I'm interested in this stuff, but I felt like the rest of the world wasn't paying a lot of attention to what's going on. Again, I think the film is funny. I tend to be pretty optimistic about things, but we do raise these questions. Most people have not paid attention as we've gone from 2,000 satellites in orbit to very quickly 10,000, and we're heading to 100,000.
Because they're going up every day.
They're going up,
or often.
It used to be a rocket went up once a month, and that was pretty good. And SpaceX is going almost every 2 days now, and we really are on this exponential curve with the number of satellites that are going up. So the question is, are humans, every time humans find some new place that's interesting, they want to go, usually some bad things start to happen pretty quickly, and this is our last not even pristine anymore, but our last bit of new territory to barge into. And so, are we going to repeat all the mistakes we've made here on Earth, or are we going to do something different? All these companies and governments and actors are incented to make this work, because the second something blows up and creates a bunch of debris, none of this stuff can operate. It's bad for everybody.
But we have to be worried about that right now. If you think about defense, right?
People make mistakes, and we show in the movie,
Yeah.
Russia. So Russia's the wild card in all this. Their space program's in the decline, but they're very proud and nation, and they have this great space history. They shot a missile a couple of years ago at one of their own satellites, just to remind everybody that they can do that. And so people can have the best intentions, but that doesn't always mean it's going to work out well.
What, after you coming in, Ross, as sort of a newbie when it comes to space, what was the thing that you took away that kind of keeps you up at night?
There's so much. Again, this idea of private individuals kind of pulling the strings. Listen, space debris. Just the idea that, I read the other day that if for some reason our internet goes out, we lose GPS, we lose satellites, there's no real backup plan. It's one of those things where who knows what could go down if one of these worst case scenarios happen. The fact that there's no real backup plan, that's kind of one of the most frightening things to me.
Have you seen Leave the World Behind with Julia Roberts?
Oh my God, yes, I love
It's
that
kind of when things go astray and all the Teslas
It's not a documentary?
are on the highway, all coming to one space.
Those Teslas, yes, definitely see that movie.
It just reminds us how dependent we are on all those satellites and all this connectivity.
Hey, Ashley, I wanted to ask about Elon Musk, because the film is not about Elon, but there are some references to him, and you see him a little bit. I was thinking, with SpaceX being so successful at what these companies want to do, is there any chance that there's room for more than just SpaceX? Because make no mistake, they're the best at it.
Yeah, it's an open question. They're the world's biggest rocket maker and the world's biggest satellite maker, so that's a problem for some of these other companies. Lots of people have tried. Look, Rocket Lab and Peter Beck in this film are very legit. They just had their 50th launch. They did that faster than SpaceX. They got to 50 faster.
Do they become a Tesla?
No,
SpaceX, excuse me.
They've got a long way to go. The next rocket they're trying to make is a very direct competitor to the Falcon 9. I have a ton of faith that Peter Beck will figure out whatever he puts his mind to, but SpaceX is clear, the dominant force. I would say Rocket Lab. I would imagine that those two companies are the ones to stay for a long time.
I am curious, when you guys do a documentary film like this, is it a 3 or 4 hour film and it gets cut down, or right from the get-go, Ross, you're keeping it kind of lean and mean?
Well, I always like to kind of make a film whatever length it kind of needs to be. It sort of speaks to us in a way throughout the edit, but we knew very clearly this was a feature documentary, hover around 90 minutes. I always like to make it as short and effective and efficiently as possible.
So there wasn't severe editing at the end?
There's always severe editing every moment, but we're like surgeons by the end. We're cutting out every frame that makes sense to cut out. It's really, I love the process. We had an incredible editor, Patient Porter, on this film, my producer, Jay Callahan. It was just a great team. So.
All right, just got about a couple of minutes. I am curious, we are curious. What do you want people, or why do you want them to watch it, and what do you want them to take away? Let me go to you first, Ross.
I like to go into these movies without any really preconceived notions going in, and I don't like to think about what people will take away from it at the end. I just want people to go in, see this movie, try to just understand it. One of the things I like to do is just trick people into caring.
Yeah.
So in a way, through great characters, great stories, that's kind of what I love to do. And then the information and all the different issues and problems, hopefully through these characters, they will come to a place where they care about the issues that these characters care about.
You told stories and you gave us a lot to care about. How about for you, Ashley? What do you want people to come away with?
Well, look, for 60 years, space was dominated by a handful of governments. Almost any story you've ever seen about space revolves around that. It's some courageous pilot, it's some genius in a room solving a problem. our film, I think, is the first to ever look at the reality of what space is like now, which is this is a business. It's full of real humans. There's struggle, there's comedy, there's tragedy, there's pride, there's ego, all of that. And so, I really honestly, I cover this stuff all the time for many years. I think this is the first true look at what modern space looks like, and it's amazing.
Modern space also means there's going to be a lot more companies. I mean, already there were a lot, right?
Absolutely. We're kind of in this weird period where the first wave, there's a few going bankrupt, but there's already many, many rocket startups coming to replace them. And so, I mean, we're in the very first innings of where all this is going as far as commercial space is concerned.
Well, congratulations, guys. Thank you
Thanks
so much. We enjoyed watching it, and good luck. And it's making its debut, Wild Wild Space, a new HBO documentary premiering 9 p.m. tonight, Wall Street time on HBO. So check it out, everybody.
Yeah, the film based on Ashley Vance's book, When the Heavens Went on Sale, the misfits and geniuses racing to put space within reach. He's also a features writer at Bloomberg Businessweek. Also with us, Ross Kaufman, Academy Award winner, the director of Wild Wild Space. Check out the film tonight at 9 p.m.
We watched. We loved.
It's very, very good.
Incredible.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Business Week podcast. Catch us live weekday afternoons from 2 to 5 p.m. Eastern. Listen on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business App. Or watch us live on YouTube.
Sticking on the topic of space this hour, our next guest sure knows a lot about it. She has spent more than 4,000 hours in space and been part of 3 NASA missions, including a 6-month mission to the International Space Station that launched one day after her 50th birthday.
Now retired, Catherine Coleman breaks down the insights she found essential to her success. It's all in her book, Sharing Space, An Astronaut's Guide to Mission, Wonder, and Making Change. She joined me, along with Bloomberg's Katie Greifeld.
In some ways, by being a retired astronaut, I get to go out and talk a lot and talk about my experiences. And I am somebody that actually kind of processes their life through talking, with others and makes decisions that way. And it's, I think what needed to be in the book, sort of got brought together by going out and doing these talks and looking out into audiences and realizing what was essential. Like I remember one group of women they were all like seniors in college being courted at the very big computer conference. Basically being their speaker and realizing that this was an audience of about 100 young women, all in computer science and engineering, and realizing that this is them. They are the future, and I have only like 20 minutes to impart to them things I think they really need to know. So the little moments like that, I think, really led to the book.
Well, I want to talk a little bit about your career because it's been so interesting. I mean, a PhD from UMass Amherst. You went to MIT. ROTC was sort of your introduction into service, it sounds like. Can you start at like give us the abridged version of how you found yourself, how you were able to become an astronaut? What was it like?
One of the 2 main reasons that I wrote the book was that you're up there, and it's not just about the floating, you see my hair be big and we're floating around. It's about the fact that you fly from place to place. It's the only way to get around, and it kind of reminds you that you're in a place that almost nobody else is, and all the rules are different, which is extremely important for science and all the stuff we can learn up there. And at the same time, it's also a human thing to realize that you are one of, in this case, right now there's 12 people up in space on different space stations as we speak, and they're at the very edge.
I literally cannot imagine it. And I always wonder how people prepare themselves for things. How do you even prepare for an experience that you've never had before? I mean, what is the physical reality of training look like to get ready to be in space?
I think there's all that practicing. It's the reality of needing to be as safe as you can be. Spaceflight will never be safe, but we need to be as safe as we can. And that means you, as a crew member, being able to do your part. If this happens, we need to do this. If there's a fire alarm, you need to, don your mask and get to the main computer and, and take the certain steps. And so we practice those things, we drill them, and we're also, of course, graded and watched and observed. And that adds that extra tension that helps you make the mistakes that you might make on the real day when that stress comes from seeing actual smoke or realizing you might need to leave the space station really quickly. So we do practice all those things. We've got great, smart instructors, but then it is really just amazing to then be up there and be able to operate. And I think also to be able to be sort of mentally present as a human. That's another big important part to think about before you go.
Yeah, and again, so many things that I can't imagine about what you just said. Seeing smoke in space and being able to control oneself is pretty remarkable. And I'm curious what it's like coming back, because you see clips on YouTube sometimes of astronauts coming back from space and they forget that there's gravity on Earth, and they drop whatever they're holding because they expect it to just, float by them. I mean, have you had any experiences like that? What does the return trip actually look like?
Well, I would say the words sad, wild, and then just nice to be home. I really didn't want to leave. It takes a couple months to get good at the work up there, about not just understanding how to keep everything in its place and do all the experiments and get more done. It really has about a month-long learning curve. So you just want to stay and get more done. And I felt like my family would be there when I got home. And so I wanted to stay. So I was a little sad. It is, as Scott Kelly, I was on a crew with Scott, and he talked to us before we came home and talked to us about what landing was like. He said it's the best e-ticket ride you will ever go on. Where, you're coming down and spacecraft are built this way, where we have an ablative shield under the spacecraft. That means it's supposed to actually burn up, and pieces of burning spacecraft are supposed to go by the windows. Wow. And so knowing that is very comforting. Actually having it narrated and understanding what's happening. And he's like, and then parachute opening. And he looks at me and goes, Coleman, set a timer, parachute opening, because you need to make sure that you are not talking because it is so abrupt. And then that capsule is spinning and swinging, and it is really wild. And then it settles down, and then you're just watching the sort of the feet clock down, and you're realizing you're just going to hit the ground with a really big solid thunk, and you just hope you're not going to get dragged around by that parachute.
Hey, Katie, I'm wondering if you can talk to us a little bit about the way that borders kind of melt in space. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because, the ISS, for example, U.S. Space Agency, Roscosmos, Russian Space Agency, European Space Agency, Japan, Canada. Oftentimes you're with people from all over the world as an astronaut. And although countries might not get along on the ground, sometimes you're getting along in space. And I'm wondering what your experience was seeing the world kind of come together in space.
Being part of, not just the mission up there, but the getting ready. It's been my experience that, the governments say this is what we're going to do together, and there's formal agreements, but it is the people that really bring the mission together and make it happen, because it happens by having dinner with each other, by going for walks, by saying, what's your family like? Can I meet your family? And that's really what brought our crew together. And so being up there, especially in times like these, all I can say is, from what I understand, everyone is doing their job, and that means on the ground, that means the crew up in space, and not even thinking about not doing their job, because the mission itself is really, really clear. Up there, you are together as a crew, keeping each other safe. And, down here on the ground, we don't always agree with each other. I hear all about it on your show, and it's not easy. And sometimes you just have to put the things you can't agree about. They're not part of the mission right now, which is, in our case down here, figuring out how are we going to make sure that everybody can live safely down here on Earth.
What do you make of the rise of private enterprise, companies like SpaceX and certainly Boeing to a lesser extent, supplanting a lot of what NASA has historically done?
The more the merrier, not to trivialize it, but more people in the game bringing their ideas, their new ways to do things, and doing them in concert. We talk about these companies as if they're alone, but they're often doing things with NASA, for NASA. And I think, each of these, we talk about the billionaires, but each of them has a vision, and they have resources, and they have, a vision of how to pave the way to space for more people. And each of those visions I find to be valuable. And I like to look, more at the substance than at the people there, and just to see what they're accomplishing. And I like what each of them are doing. The more people you bring up on orbit, the more people get that view and understand actually the magnitude of what we can do.
One thing we wanted to talk about is Mars. And we mentioned Elon Musk's lifelong dream is to colonize Mars. What are your thoughts on colonizing Mars or actually putting humans on that planet eventually?
Absolutely. We will be doing that. And I think it's a good time for everybody to be thinking about it and how to do it. And even thinking, I like to think about settling Mars, which to me implies more like having a plan and going there together. And for one country to be the only country there doesn't seem like the right thing to me. And I think that comes from that view from the space station of looking back at the Earth. And you talked about dissolving borders. When I look back there, I see, first of all, I feel very close to home. But second, I see that everyone could be and actually is so connected if only they knew how much we could accomplish more together. And that includes doing the most important thing I think we'll do, which is colonizing and going off and settling on Mars.
Very, very cool. Thank you so much for sharing some of your journey with us. You can read more about Katie Coleman's journey in her new book out today. It's called Sharing Space, An Astronaut's Guide to Mission, Wonder, and Making Change. This is Business Week.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Business Week podcast. Listen live each weekday starting at 2 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business App. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
From space exploration to exploring the first Porsche 911 hybrid.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah.
You heard that right.
Yeah, I would do both.
Yeah, exactly, right? Back in May, Porsche unveiled the first hybrid version of its most famous sports car, the 911. It is the Carrera GTS with a newly developed 3.6-liter six-cylinder engine with a single electrically driven turbocharger, say that 5 times fast, and an in-transmission electric motor that reduces lag times to nil as the car sprints forward. I sound like I'm Hannah Elliott.
I was going to say,
I'm reading her words.
We know all that thanks to Hannah Elliott. It also comes with a whopping price tag of just about $165,000. So not cheap, but it's a Porsche. So you wouldn't expect it to kind of be, affordable to many people. And for those Porsche files worried about the electrification that could spell the end of the 911, don't worry about it. So says Bloomberg News auto columnist Hannah Elliott, who recently took the car out for a spin.
There were a lot of 911 lovers and Porsche purists who were very reticent about the idea of electrifying their beloved 6-cylinder engine. Porsche made that engine famous in 1963, and I myself was hesitant. You don't know what to expect. Porsche actually removed a turbocharger from this engine, and then it made the existing turbocharger larger and then added an electric motor. So there's a lot going on under the hood. And, we kind of didn't know what to expect, but I'm happy to report to you that the Carrera 911 GTS hybrid is really fabulous. And honestly, it was, in a good way, very unremarkable. It's got about 60 horsepower more than the previous version, and it's a little bit faster, but you know what? At the end of the day, you'd be hard pressed, as I was, to even tell any difference between a hybrid 911 and the standard 911 that we love.
Hey, Carol's fighting me because she wants to ask another question. You know what, Carol? Go ahead.
No, oh God.
This is what happens.
Because your voice is a little sore
this is what
today?
happens when Hannah Elliott comes on. It's like we fight each other to get to talk to her. But go ahead and ask another, Carol.
Put the pedal to the metal, and how did it feel? And where did you ride it or drive it?
Okay, so I drove it on a track in Spain, which, yes, it does sound very glamorous, and of course it was great, but Spain is also a really great place to drive cars right now because the weather's fabulous, and these automakers can get the tracks there for pretty cheap. So they just have journalists come out to these Spanish tracks, and you spend the day driving it around.
Yeah, but Hannah, watch out for the olive trees, okay?
Well, it's interesting that you say that because this was a really interesting track. It had some sort of inclines, it had banking, it was over 3 miles long, so it was a really tricky track. And the car handles, it's so fabulous. This is why we know and love the 911, and it's also why Porsche was so hesitant to do anything to this car. This is the crown jewel of the brand, and it engenders such a fervid fan base that anything that would change, the amazing handling, the amazing braking, just the amazing power, delivery, it's kind of dangerous. You think you don't want to change something if it's working. But I have to say, truly, from a driving perspective, this new hybrid variant, it's great. Porsche didn't want to tell me how many more miles per gallon we're going to get out of the car. I think it's pretty negligible.
Huh.
Really, this is an interesting thing. You make a hybrid in order to help meet CO2 and emission standards, which is for sure true. But Porsche is also saying, look, we're actually getting a little bit more horsepower, a little bit more speed out of combining the electric motor and the turbocharger. So it's kind of a win-win. I will say, though, the biggest change for me were changes in the cabin. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if you guys want to talk about that or not, but
go there.
Yeah, of course.
Right? It's so iconic, right? You get inside a Porsche, right? The dials and so on and so forth. Tell us what the experience was like, because it sounds like that's where you were a little disappointed.
So this is where I was really surprised. The car itself, in terms of driving, it's very well within the Porsche 911 lineup. It's not the fastest, but it's in the middle. It's in the middle. Inside, though, this is really the first 911 to have a button to start the car rather than the sort of faux key fob that you go to turn on the left side, which is a really signature touch for a 911. Now they've put a button there. And Porsche has also removed all of the analog gauges. Porsche has this signature 5-gauge setup behind the steering wheel with the tachometer right in the middle. They've done away with that. Now it's screens, you've got a push button start, and they also removed the back seat. Now that's now available as a no-cost option. But people who really love the 911 and spend a lot of time in that cabin, whether they're commuting to work or driving it on the weekends, you're going to notice, I think the biggest change that you will notice is inside the cabin.
Does it feel like when you drive it that you're driving a hybrid?
No. And you know why? First of all, there's no electric-only range. You know how some plug-in hybrids, you can drive in electric-only mode for a few miles? This Carrera GTS doesn't have that. You don't even plug it in to charge. This is a mild hybrid. So all of the energy is being transferred under the hood. You're not plugging it in. You're not driving in electric-only mode. So honestly, you'll be pretty hard-pressed to feel any difference in terms of, am I driving a hybrid? Other than maybe you could feel that it's a little bit faster if you're doing if you're burning rubber from 0 to 60 miles an hour, it is about 0.3 seconds faster. So you'll feel it in that way. But just from a regular driving perspective, honestly, you're not going to feel any difference.
Scale of 1 to 10, what do you give it?
Oh, I give it 8. 8. Ooh. I like hybrids. Yeah, I think, you know what? I think hybrids, we used to think they were a bit of just a bridge technology while we all accelerated toward electric vehicles. But I have to say now, the idea of some of these sports cars becoming hybridized, where you kind of get the best of both worlds, it does make sense. And, as we're seeing EV sales sort of slow down a little bit, they're still growing, but just not at such a quick rate. The hybrids, to me, are looking really interesting because, like I said, it does kind of combine the best of both worlds. You get the pure power and really quick acceleration of a electric battery, but you also get that tangible, really fun driving feeling of internal combustion.
You contrast it with the Aston Martin's Vantage that you recently had on track as well. Why was this so different?
3 words: 4-wheel drive. That's why. I mean, it's just so much more predictable, and I'm the first to admit it makes me think I'm a better driver than I really am. The car is a lot more controlled.
Well, what I also love is you called it exuberant. You like out of the gate, it sounds like you just had a blast driving it around. And it sounds like more to come. So good. It's a great way for us to wrap up on our Friday.
Hey, if you ever want us to come on one of these trips to Spain or around the track,
yes.
Just let us know, okay?
Hey, if you want to go on the next one, be my guest. I'll sit in the corner and drink some port or something.
Okay, deal.
Done. Hannah Elliott, be well. Have a great weekend. She is auto columnist at Bloomberg Pursuits. Check her out on Twitter, on X, on Bloomberg.com, and of course at the Bloomberg Terminal.
This is the Bloomberg Businessweek podcast, available on Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. Listen live weekday afternoons from 2 to 5 p.m. Eastern on Bloomberg.com, the iHeartRadio app, TuneIn, and the Bloomberg Business App. You can also watch us live every weekday on YouTube and always on the Bloomberg Terminal.